Welcome to the PWGC Environmental Echo. I'm your host, Paul Boyce, CEO and President of PWGC. Today's topic is going to be lake and pond rehabilitation and restoration work here locally and throughout New York State. My guest and Senior Vice President and leader of our Environmental Compliance Group is Kris Almskog. He's been with the firm for, oh my God, it's well over 20 years at this point. We won't go into the exact date, but it's been a life sentence like yours truly, and we love it. But he has been the leader in our pond work over the last, 5, 6, maybe 7 years now. It's been going on, and we've been getting into quite a bit of this stuff. It's very interesting. It's very relevant to what's going on, locally and regionally lately. Due to, whether you believe in it or not, climate change, nitrogen, phosphorus, nutrients, all getting into these ponds and affecting, what's in there and what's growing in there and what's happening to them. So, we look at all different aspects of these things, be it invasive species from an aquatic type of standpoint, which could be, obviously it could be, first thing you think of as a species is a fish, but what really may affect a pond or a lake, it turns out to be the vegetation, in terms of invasive species. And we also look at some of the other water quality and water chemistry problems, often associated with algal blooms or the cyanobacteria, all those lovely different colors they turn that can be toxic and harmful to humans, pets, and aquatic life. So these are some of the issues we're trying to address as an environmental firm here in Long Island and throughout New York State. So, Kris, why don't you just tell me a little bit about your experience with some of these ponds and lakes, what you've been up to, and then we'll get into some, discussion.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Kris Almskog. I'm a professional geologist in the state of New York, and I got involved with waterways, again, probably 2 decades ago with the firm. I've always grown up on the water, always boated, swam, fished, all parts of the state and Northeast, and it's always something that really interests me. And we have a number of hundreds and thousands of ponds and lakes on Long Island. Long Island, New York, we have numerous lakes, and a lot of these lakes and ponds are man-made, and then there are natural creeks, or they would collect stormwater made for mills hundreds of years ago. And over time, natural breakdown of leaves and branches and organisms in the bottom, and a lot of these ponds have led up to significant amounts of black sediment, black organic rich mud sediments in the bottom of these ponds. In addition, as more and more people, farms, around these ponds and lakes, fertilizers from farmlands, from people fertilizing their lawns, animal wastes run off into the ponds. And then in addition, you also have invasive aquatic species that were introduced from people's fish tanks, or even from migratory birds flying, up and down the waterways, introducing them, getting stuck to duck feet, and bring them between different ponds. And it's become a serious problem because these ponds and lakes that were heavily used for recreation and for habitat, a lot of them have become they've become really dense with vegetation to the point where the recreation opportunities have diminished. Habitat for native fish, amphibians has really been decreased, and it's also affected, just the general environmental quality, and affects people's visual aesthetics of ponds and lakes, and in some ways property values as well.
I mean, you just brought up a half a dozen to a dozen different topics that just got my mind racing on all of this stuff, starting with the invasive species, and even the aquatic fowl. And I've been involved with numerous of these projects with you, and, one of the things is, we see these Canada geese, you want to talk about invasive species in my mind, these things, they're here now, they eat a lot, and they do something after they eat a lot, which ends up at the bottom of the pond or the lake, and that adds to that organic muck, debris, or whatever you want to call it, that's at the bottom of the pond, that these invasive vegetative species love to grow in, as opposed to like hard-packed, clean sand, right?
Correct.
So what are we doing? What's how do we stop the problem as opposed to, you know, and we're going to get into what the Band-Aid or the fix is, that these real rehabilitations or restorations, but is there a way to even stop the problem before it happens?
There are various aspects that you can kind of look at this, much like many problems. And one is outreach and education should always be the first step about, you know, just about septic systems and fertilizing lawns, and about, you know, proper animal control, and you know, Canada geese, they are a significant issue, you know, in many parts of the state, overpopulations, you know, which isn't healthy for the species and it isn't healthy for the ecosystem. Unfortunately, hunting them, I don't think is really going to be that's a tricky one, and it's not just Canada goose excrement, which is the problem.
Yeah.
But it's a number of issues, and you know what we're seeing is a big step they've taken in parts of, especially the Adirondacks, has been education and outreach and signage and even permitting. You know, you bring a boat and you want to put it in Lake George, they have stops that you have to go and wash your boat out. Sometimes you're even checked, and before you're even given a sticker before you can put your boat in those waterways, because the concern is that you'll have something on your trailer, on the boat, in the bilge, invasive species.
Yeah, Chris, I've heard people with even
Yeah.
fishing equipment,
Correct.
the anchors on the boat, the lines, you know, everything. It's like
Those all get checked. I was in a regatta in Lake George a few years ago, and we had to brought a boat from Long Island up there, and we had to clean out everything with a mild bleach solution, then have it inspected, you know, visually inspected before we were allowed to put the boat in the water. So that is one of the first steps of, you know, it's kind of education and institutional controls to kind of limit potential spreads that would be for invasive species. But then also for that, you want to educate people about the negative effects of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, you know, from laundry cleansers as well, that when they go in the dry wells or runoff, they flush into the lakes, and those are big contributors to algal blooms. You know, that initially you hear things down here in the bays, red algae, brown algae, mahogany tide, but then you have blue-green algae, which are known to be toxic. And a lot of these things, although many of the algal blooms don't really have an immediate health effect on humans, a lot of them do kill off a lot of the clams, oysters that are on the bottom, which are filter feeders, and also clean the bays. This is salt water now we're getting to, as opposed to ponds. So there is an effect, you know, a domino effect, where you start to wreak havoc on a little bit of the population and the habitat, and that in chase causes detrimental effects to other parts of the ponds and lakes as well.
I mean, you touched on a lot again, and it goes back maybe a couple of podcasts ago. We talked about nitrogen from sanitary systems, from homes, you know, being a major problem down here on Long Island. You know, we're putting it all into the groundwater, and ultimately it's flowing, you know, ended up in these surface water bodies as a nutrient source, and it's just, you know, like fertilizer for, you know, an invasive species. You know, but you brought up another point, you know, how this stuff gets there in the first place. You know, it could come in on a bird or a fowl, or it could come in on a boat. You know, you hear stories about people dumping fish tanks, you know. Is that true? Does that happen? I mean, and you know, you talked about education, you know, how do you stop it? How do you prevent it? How do you educate people not to, you know, your fish is all of a sudden, you know, you're moving or whatever, you want to get rid of the fish, you don't dump it in a pond.
The invasive species that is how most of it, you know, most scientists think they got there by fish tanks, and people would, you know, when they get tired, they dump their fish tank in the street. You have some weeds kind of go down and wash into the local pond. And one of the things that's been done to stop that, you know, fish stores are, you know, limited on what aquatic plants they could sell, you know, in order to minimize that impact. But once it really gets into, something like an aquatic invasive species gets into a lake or a pond or a river system, it is a tricky thing to, you know, totally eradicate. And we can talk about, you know, some of the methods a little bit later. But the invasive species that's generally brought in through fish tanks, there are stories about, about boating and bringing it through boating, and and migratory waterfowl as well that introduce it. But they say the main cause is fish tanks and what people have brought in. It looks nice in their fish tank. The same reason it grows very well in a fish tank. It's very hardy. It's hard to kill. It thrives on nutrient rich. So the fish in the fish tank, the nutrients that the fish let off, it'll cause those aquatic invasive aquatic weeds and plants to grow really well. Is why they do very well in a pond or a lake where you do have lots of nutrients and you have this layer of soft organic rich soft sediment in the bottom, which again it's very easy to take root in those materials. They are just a bundle of nutrients ready to kind of take that invasive weed and give it the energy it needs to grow and then spread out. And we've seen pictures of lakes and ponds and been in lakes and ponds where unfortunately you can't cast a fishing pole because you can't reel it back, you can't kayak, you can't canoe,
can't swim.
It's almost to the point where you could walk across the not necessarily lily pads, but the weeds floating at top. So it has become a major problem in suburban areas. Not as much in rural areas yet, but it's something that is spreading, and it is better to avoid. Once you have the problem, it's much better to find ways to avoid it through education, permitting before it gets there, because then the remedial efforts and the cost, unfortunately, get driven significantly higher, and the permitting requirements.
Now, most of these invasive species, if I'm not mistaken, generally grow in more shallow water, right? And here on Long Island, we have a lot of ponds that are maybe less than 10 feet deep, lakes that are less than 10 feet deep. They're pretty shallow. So this
Correct.
stuff, it's getting plenty of sunlight down there. And, is this a similar issue upstate where you may have some deeper lakes?
It doesn't. You're not going to have the problem at least in deeper lakes, at least in the deeper portions of lakes. You'll get it skirting around the outskirts of the ponds and the lakes, but you will get it in the shallower lakes. And like you said, 10 foot is generally the depth at which photosynthesis and the plants really have a hard time getting started if they're deeper than 10 feet due to photosynthesis. You also have the thermal segregation of the waters in deeper lakes.
Yep.
Which basically you have an oxygenation issue in lakes and ponds, and the oxygen and transfer of the oxygen through the lakes and ponds also are one of the things that help break down that organic rich layer at the bottom. So once a pond or a lake, once a lake is deeper than 10 feet, generally the deeper parts of the lake are immune to these, at least the invasive species, but you will get it around the perimeter of the lake.
How do we treat the stuff? How do we get rid of it once it's in there? I know there's numerous techniques, technologies, methods, means to get this stuff out and try to keep it out. But what are we seeing that's effective around here? What are we employing these days? What hasn't worked so well? What are your thoughts on that stuff? You have to look at each system independently and figure out what are your limitations. And some of those limitations are going to be, one, there are going to be permits involved with state, local, possibly federal agencies to see what you're allowed to do. You're going to have to look at the lake and the pond. Who is the owner? Who are the surrounding owners? And generally you need a consensus on how you're going to treat this. So you need to get buy-in from the stakeholders on treatment. You need to look at, if there are any specific fish, wildlife that are critical or endangered in the area, and that might really limit some of these options as far as how you move forward. And time frame, schedule, and then cost. How are you going to cover these things? Those are all factors that have to be taken a look at in each application. But generally, you want to really evaluate the lake and pond. How big is it? How deep is it? How thick is that muck layer? How dense are the weeds? What is the turnover rate, which is a big one of the lake system? Turnover in terms of like the residence time of water in there?
Correct.
How long it takes to volume of water in the pond or lake to turn over? It goes from
Exactly.
Okay.
That turnover rate, if it's a very slow turnover rate, then some options that have been employed successfully are use of herbicides to basically broadcast in the lake at the right time of year when those plants are really absorbing the herbicides. You could broadcast them, and you might have to do this every few seasons, but if you do it the right time of year, and if the turnover of the lake is slow enough, meaning once you put that herbicide in the lake, you don't want it to just wash right through the lake system and go downstream and not be effective. So you really need to understand, the science and your inputs and outputs of the lake. But herbicides are a proven method to deal with it. They do have their downsides, and again, you have to look at the ecology of the lake and the lake system before you do that and get permits. There are other options, such as going out there and just hand pulling the weeds. That's a very labor intensive, and again, it's not going to be a permanent fix. It's going to need to be maintenance time after time, but that is something that can be done. There are mechanical rakes and floating rakes where you can go in and rake the weeds up, and that does help. But
mechanical harvesting is what I believe it's called, right?
Correct.
I don't want to say we're mowing the lawn, but we're
you're basically mowing the lawn on the lake, and it's very effective in the short term, and that's one of the other limiting factors. You really have to figure out your stakeholders. Do they mind doing like maintenance activities? Is that something that they want, or do they really want to try and kill off the weed as much as possible, and then have reduce the maintenance required to control it? So some other issues that have been employed have been using fish such as carp to go and eat the weeds.
The grass carp, yeah.
And that works for a while until the carp get old and lazy, and then they don't tend to eat as much. We're also looking at technologies such as putting mats over the weeds and basically starving them for
benthic
sunlight.
mats, yeah.
And that is a fairly easy, low-cost option, but again, you can only do small portions of the lake at once, and those do need to be moved, and the weeds will eventually come back. Other options include introducing oxygen to the bottom muck layer to break down that the organic rich material a little quicker. This has been employed in some places that we're looking into to see, there are definite limitations on that technology, such as turnover and how quickly the water is moving and how thick the muck layer is. So that's something that can be explored. Probably the best way to control the weeds in the long term is to remove that organic rich layer from the bottom of the lake or pond. And that would be through dredging or lowering the lake and doing excavation and getting down to a clay or rock or sand or gravel where the weeds really won't take root as quickly and easily. So those are the main methods that are being employed.
What about, the one other thing you didn't mention, I've heard, I haven't seen it, and we've discussed it, is freezing, right?
Yes.
Does that work? Is that practical? I mean, unless it's got to be like, in Antarctica or someplace where it's cold enough to do it.
It does work, but in let's say, in my discussions with DEC, they've had some success in the northern part of the state where they could basically lower or drain the lake or pond over an extreme winter. And if it gets cold enough, and if that frost, you can penetrate into that muck layer deep enough to kill the weed, kill the invasive weed, kill the root system, then it will be effective. But it's so the geographic region that you can do that is limited, and you need a really harsh, long winter and a good you need to get the permafrost down deep enough in order to affect where the roots of the weeds are. So on New York City area, it has not been advised, and I don't think there have been any really successful options. If you lower a lake for over winter, you will have a short-term effect on it. The weeds aren't going to come back as strong the next year, and that's DEC, and we've talked about that as being like a cyclical kind of a restoration approach, and that is tricky to get permits for if you're looking to do it every year because of the concerns about how the amphibians and other animals and fish would affect.
We've had turtle issues. We've fish. You got to be mindful.
Yes.
So is it, all of those you mentioned, physical, chemical, mechanical, climatological type of means to, eradicate these invasive species. And what I'm primarily focusing on here is, again, the vegetation, the weeds, if you will, the fanwort, the milfoil, all those stuff that's real hardy, real invasive, real prolific, especially if you have the conditions. But what about, like, we mentioned some of the bacteria problems, the water quality, the cyanobacteria, the blue-green algae, the other fun stuff that gets in there. And, I've been reading some stuff real recent, has to do with applying like hydrogen peroxide and the use of like ultrasonic type of energy. What kind of success, are you familiar with any of that stuff that we could share with our listeners?
Yes, a lot of it is they're doing a lot of pilot tests in New York. They're doing several pilot tests in New York to really look at how successful some of those new technologies can be, and they all have an application, at least in a lab, and they're seeing how they could be scaled up to really be effective on a lake or pond size application. Things like the ultrasonic technology. That theory is that as the algae starts to form, you hit it with an ultrasonic wave that causes the algae almost to sink down to the bottom, and it's no longer a problem. And at the same time, dosing the lake or pond with peroxide will have a similar effect on killing off the algae if it's done at the right time. They've also looked at ways to take out some of the lake and pond water and filter it to get out some of the algae as well. So again, the algae is basically caused by the nutrient loading into the pond. So all these things are valid options to look at. They should also be looked at is how do we control the reoccurring problem. So in addition to...
You're reading my mind. Yeah. We're doing the Band-Aids here.
Correct.
We're not treating the the cause, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think each one has an application that would work. You want to focus on how do we treat the reoccurring source of the problem, because doing that Band-Aid year after year after year after year,
it's costly.
It's unsightly. It's so it should be part of a bigger remedial effort to look at where the source is coming from, and how do we change practices or sewer, or maybe we could design some bioswales where the road runoff is to so we have an upland vegetation that absorbs a lot of those nutrients before they get into the pond. So things like that should really be looked at as part of a bigger remedial approach to those issues, because the treatment of the blue-green algae, once you have it, it's part of the problem, but it doesn't solve the problem, and you're still going to have those reoccurring areas that still get the blue-green algae and the other algal blooms that just really are unsightly and potentially dangerous.
Oh man, it just it just blows my mind, how we treat the symptom and not the cause. And again, it's short term, it's easier, it's quicker. You get something done, but it's going to come back.
Yeah.
So it's just mind blowing here. You mentioned a little bit about the regulatory requirements. Obviously the state, some of the local agencies here in New York City, the island, upstate. What are some of the real big permitting obstacles with trying to do some of these, treatments or restorations or techniques that we want to employ? Like you said, a benthic mat. That's, it's simple. You put a mat down on top of the stuff so sunlight, you can ballast it so it doesn't float away, prevents sunlight from getting down there, and they die off, but, they can come back. What's involved in terms of, convincing a regulatory agency that, this is the way to go?
Well, generally, the general main regulatory agency who's going to have the authority is going to be DEC, but then you're also likely going to be dealing with a local town agency, and possibly a federal agency as well, depending on the waterway. And DEC, I'd say their main concern is what remedial or restoration effort that you take, how is it going to affect the fish and the amphibians and other aquatic life and waterfowl in that area. Is it going to have any significant effect on them or potential on animals that are downstream? what is going to be the effect. And the local DEC office generally knows, most of the lakes and ponds in the area, is familiar with some of the issues. So any approach or any approach that you're looking to take, you'll want to have some meetings with DEC to discuss it before you put in a formal application, to make sure if they've seen something locally that's worked on a pond or a lake like that, you could discuss it. If they've seen things that didn't work, they're more likely to question, why do you think your application would work in your sense. There are also ways, things like the vegetative mats. If it's a small enough area in the lake, you could get permits, research permits, to try it out in a small area, and it might not take as long to secure a permit if DEC knows you're going to be working in a small area and seeing what the effects are. So we're currently doing something with New York State DOT for some of the New York City reservoirs, looking at how they could possibly improve their spec design for stormwater sand filters that come off their New York State DOT highways.
Yep.
With the purpose of how do they design the sand filters, possibly with bioswales, to reduce mainly phosphorus they're looking at. So when there's excrement or waste on the road that gets washed off, and before it gets into a creek that's going to feed one of the reservoirs, they're looking for ways to capture that waste, put it through a sand filter before it gets into the creek, and have that sand filter and the vegetation absorb the nutrients before it gets to the, again, they're trying to solve the problem before the reservoir gets heavily laden with some of these nutrients. So that's an exciting project we're working on, looking at sampling, looking at sampling the pre and post levels of during certain rainfall events, to see how these sand filters are performing now, so we can help redesign and see how can they be designed even better in the future.
Wow. So. And I've been involved, like I said, numerous projects, and a lot of our projects involved actually either lowering the lake water level or draining it completely. And always a hot topic when you do that is what's going to happen downstream. You're releasing a larger volume of water than's normally coming out of this thing. We either have a dam or a weir, and we pull a few boards out or the whole thing out, and water starts flowing out. There's always concerns about downstream dams, or there's concerns about downstream water quality. Can you talk a little bit about some of the obstacles we may face if if somebody's trying to look to lower the water, to maybe, as you mentioned, excavate it or dredge it or whatever they want to do?
Yep, that's a good question. And one of the projects we recently worked on had to do with lowering the water, and we had to, before we were even able to think about lowering it, we had to do basically a dam safety evaluation of the condition of the existing earthen berm dam, to ensure that in the process it wasn't going to give way and things weren't going to go out. So that was the first step in doing that. But then once that was done and we were getting permits to actually lower the lake, we had to really concern ourselves with things such as turbidity, because you do have a pent-up amount of sediment in the lake, and you don't want to just move the problem somewhere else. So that's a big issue that that DEC and nearby communities and property owners are worried about. Some of the other things that should be thought about in advance, especially if they're sensitive fisheries downstream, will be what effect is lowering the lake going to have on the temperature of the water downstream. You have certain fish that need a certain spawning temperature, a certain spawning range for effective spawning, and they need clean, sandy, gravelly bottoms as well for spawning as well. So, so those are some of the things that you have conversations with DEC about, and you talk to their fisheries people and to understand what's downstream, what are going to be the significant limitations, and when you go to the design, how are you going to lower the lake, how are you going to lower the pond, you better understand what engineering controls and
that's where I came
programs.
In. That's I know more about that than the actual the issue with turbidity downstream.
Yep.
What are we doing to the fish, the turtles, the frogs, the eels?
And then they also have limitations on the time of year that you should raise or lower the lake, because once the turtles and once things start to hibernate for the winter, you don't want to be adjusting the water level, before or after the hibernation. So you really need to time the lowering, effectively, so you're not having a negative effect on creatures that do winter and burrow for the season. So those are the main, turbidity, temperature, and kind of the seasonality and the timing of when you lower those things, really are going to be, the key drivers. Then also you just have to think about when it is lowered, is this going to be 1 season, 2 seasons for the sediment to dry out, for it to be, effectively removed, because this material some of it has like a pudding type consistency, and for it to be removed it needs to dry up a little bit before it can be scraped out.
That's a very good point, dealing with the stuff, and once you get it out of the pond, what do we do with it?
It usually part of the DEC permitting process, we're going in and we're taking sediment samples. Sometimes we do it when the lake's frozen. We walk out there, drill a hole like we're ice fishing. Sometimes we go out in a small boat and we grab sediment samples from various areas of the lake bottom. We run those for various analytical parameters to see, are those sediments safe? Are they impacted in any way? And then we look at options. Quite often, we could use those sediments at a local landfill as daily cap material. We have been looking at ways to reuse them in town and county parks. We were just very successful. I think, from what I understand, it might have been the first New York State DEC beneficial use determination to use some of these sediments in an agricultural setting. So we took out several thousand yards of sediment from a pond on the east end, and it had some elevated nutrients as it collects runoff and the
Sure.
organic material breaks down, but otherwise it was fairly clean. We got permission to take it to a local farm and deposit it on the farm. That farmer now is going to till it into the topsoil, and it's going to reduce his need for adding additional fertilizer that he would have had to in the past.
Beneficial use, huh?
Yep, so we're very excited about that, and hoping that that could be a model going forward, because one of the limitations, as we talked about it being the cost, generally the main limitation on excavating or dredging ponds is it's going to be expensive to get rid of the material. So if we could find ways to find alternatives to disposing of it or paying to landfill it, and those are beneficial alternatives, we see that as being a step in the right direction towards helping remediate or restore additional ponds throughout the state.
So just trying to get the stuff to dry out. If you pull it out as opposed to leaving it in place, what do we do? Do we build a berm? Do we put it in like the geotubes or the geosocks? What have we done on a recent project?
You can pump it into like an earthen dike if you're doing hydraulic dredging. If you're leaving the lake the same level and you're going to basically suck the water, you suck out some water, some sediment, and you could pump that into an earthen dike. You can do it into geotubes, which are long, basically sausage casings with a filter. Depending on the sediment size, they could clog up fairly quickly. So that has to be, looked at in advance to make sure it's not gonna fail upon implementation. If it's hard in most of the settings I've seen. You could, if the lake or pond is small enough, you could dredge, with a specialty excavation bucket, and then dump it into the, build a small earthen berm on the side of the lake or pond while it dries out. There are also options depending on how quickly the project needs to move. You could mix certain kiln dust and other things with it to dry it out quicker if need be, if you need to get it up and away from the lake or pond site quicker, so you could restore, the lakeside area. So
you're leading me to more questions. Like when we pull this stuff out of the pond, and we want to put it someplace to dry or store it. Oftentimes there could be odors. As it's drying, there could be dust. What do we do to mitigate that stuff, especially if it's in an area that may be surrounded by residential or businesses or somebody that may be affected?
If it's odors, depending on, you could always cap it with plastic, temporarily. The other thing that could be done is quickly go and plant some seed on it, so it kind of, it almost, then it crusts over, you get some vegetation, it could crust over. A recent project, we were worried about the odors as the lake went down
Yeah.
and the weeds died, and it turned out to not be as a significant event as we thought, because we lowered it in the, by the time things lowered in, in the fall, people's windows were more closed, and the odor from the breakdown was not as strong as we anticipated. So it just didn't have the effect. So we haven't seen the odor being an issue. As for dust, a lot of these piles, if they are uncovered, when they're dry, they'll start to get some vegetation naturally, and that reduces the dust as well, and hasn't really been an issue. Transporting them, again, is tricky, just because they are very soupy to begin with.
Yeah.
So we've done things such as poly-lined trucks that we've had to do to make sure when the truck drives down the street, things aren't seeping out, and specialty, the truck goes off on riprap and cleans off the tires, so we're not traipsing things in the neighborhood. So it depends on the setting and how to design the removal process.
So going forward, what's the grand scheme? What's the plan? How do we afford to restore these ponds? How do we afford to prevent them from getting to this place? I mean, obviously sewering and innovative alternative sanitary systems to remove night, we know that, but what else can be done?
The state state DEC is doing a lot of outreach. They have groups dedicated to trying to address the issue, community groups, and there are other community activism groups that are kind of trying to educate as well. But it's going to need to be completed on multi levels of government, community groups, stakeholders.
Yeah, this is not a magic bullet or one size fits all. I get it. But
yeah, the sewers and a combination of reducing or applying fertilizers when it's best to apply them, so you're reducing runoff. Sewering, areas that are close to water bodies, where the groundwater is negatively affecting them. Those are going to have to be major steps in any kind of long-term, lake restoration. As far as the invasive species, once they're in, we're looking at, for several clients right now, we're looking at several options, some being short-term and some being long-term, because again, some of the larger options in excavation or dredging are quite costly. So we're seeing if there's a two-tiered approach where you could have a short-term gain, as you're building up to the final dredging or excavation of the pond. We've discussed some things with DEC as far as maybe some ponds we could possibly make deeper, so therefore deeper are the ponds. You may get some around the perimeter, some weeds, but the deeper areas will be free from weeds and invasives. So you could still enjoy a large portion of the pond as recreational use.
So what do you do with the material you mucked out them to make them deeper?
That's up to the owner of the pond and the lake on how
And the regulator, I guess.
We
too.
have looked at that as a way to possibly offset the cost of some of these pond remediations, and if the circumstances are right, it could possibly be something that works. Again, a lot of ponds are owned by municipalities, local governments, sometimes by community groups and a community association. So, if one of the best things they could do is just start the dialogue early, because the permitting process, possibly getting grant money or, getting the funding to do it may take several years. So I'd say what I've seen with many of the pond projects we've been involved in, usually we're involved for 2 to 3 years before any shovel hits the ground. That's design, permitting, looking at alternative options, and obtaining, the municipality obtaining the funding sources available. So, if they think they have a problem, or even before they have a problem, just start planning, look at some of the literature that's out there to, educate the community, about what the downside is if they don't. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So educate the community about how to avoid a circumstance like that occurring before it occurs. If it already exists, then start evaluating some of the options and see what fits your specific set of criteria and your limitations. Then, work with an engineer or consultant to see, and the regulators to see what some of the options are.
Interesting. And I hope our listeners get an appreciation of the diversity of the problems that some of these lakes and ponds and streams can face, from we just talked about water levels to water quality to invasive species to, muck and geese, and it just goes on and on and on, And I think it was a very interesting discussion, Kris.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate your time today. So I do want to wrap up and thank our listeners for joining us. We are PWGC, and this is our podcast. If there are further questions or comments, or you'd like to, reach out to us, you can always get us at pwgrosser.com/podcast. I am Paul Boyce, your host, and I do want to thank everyone for joining us again today. It's been a pleasure to have Kris Almskog, our Senior Vice President of the Environmental Compliance Group at PWGC, and I hope everyone found this as educational, informative as I have. Thank you.